Where would we be, quite frankly, without John Roscombe? Where would we be? When I started to read this book, Greg, I of course noted your title, When We Were Young and Foolish. By the time I finished, I was going to ring you and say it needs to be retitled, When We Were Young and Not So Foolish, actually. Because this is a book which chronicles Greg's early and momentous years, and of course he has chronicled our times, our life and times, for decades since he left university. He writes of the most important political decade of my life, which was of course the 70s, because I was at university then. He talks about the preeminent issues that arose in Australia during the 1970s, and these were powerful and life-changing and, quite frankly, in many cases, earth-shattering issues. The whole nature of international communism and its spread through Southeast Asia, and what its continued spread would have meant for the world. The whole debate about Vietnam and the end of the Vietnam War. The case for Israel, and what I've always considered a racist and anti-Semitic and violent campaign actually against Israel and the Jewish population of this world by the left under the guise of Palestinian autonomy. That was a debate which raged then and rages now. The whole history of the anti-Americanism on campuses around the world. One of our all-time favourites, the emergence of liberation theology during the 1970s, led by the World Council of Churches, for those that remember those times, and the WCC's campaign to use liberation theology as a means of encouraging emerging nations to swing to the political left. The Cold War itself, and then to more minor domestic matters of state, such as anti-Fraserism, the battle for ideas on student campuses, the National Civic Council on voluntary student unionism. That was the backdrop to the 1970s. That is a backdrop to Greg's book, which I have much pleasure in launching tonight. And I say to you that if you have any interest in the political debates of then and now, this book is an essential part of anybody's reading. As John has said, this is a trip down memory lane through the life and times of Greg Sheridan. And thank God for Greg Sheridan, quite frankly, because who chronicles our international standing, international debates? Who chronicles Australia's place in the world better than Greg? As he has for decades, particularly the emphasis on Australia's relations with Asia. He is the truth teller. So as John Roscombe points out, and I'll come to this a bit later, when there are myths made in the press about historical facts, it is Greg Sheridan who holds up truth to the light, and very quickly the myths of the less dissipate. This is a book about Greg training to be a priest, about Greg being an acolyte of the National Civic Council, about B.A. Santa Maria, about being a Republican, about working for Fairfax. It gets better. Then he started working for the Bulletin. He met Tony Abbott. He became a union official. But then, lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, he ended up from 1984 onwards at that spiritual home of all Team Australia members and supporters, the Australian newspaper. The home, as I said, of Team Australia. This is a book about some of the great figures of the 1970s, and I'm glad, John, you mentioned Frank Knopfelmacher, and Peter Westmore, and Gerard Henderson, Laurie Short, Dennis Warner, Bill Hartley, John Herzog, Turnbull, Danby, Costello, Eason, John Carrick, Mao, Trotsky and Lenin, Mary Alexander, unions such as the SDA, the BWIU, the BLF, Norm Gallagher, John Ducker, Mark Ahrens. This is a cavalcade of goodies and baddies, as someone once described events in the Middle East. It also, I must say, by point of criticism, spends far too much time talking about your relationship with Bob Carr. who I must say with Kevin Rudd, make Bronwyn Bishop, as foreign ministers, make Bronwyn Bishop's travel expenses look like she's Pope Benedict. Since 1984, Greg has used all of the experience he gained during the 1970s to write with such clarity and purpose and intellectual strength in one of the great newspapers of the Western world. And I say, where would we be without John Roscoe and the IPA? Where would we be without Greg Sheridan? And quite frankly, where would this country be without the Australian newspaper, for goodness sake? What we have is a man born in a Catholic family who understood the importance of anti-communism. It's interesting, Greg, because you describe in detail your concerns about communism. In general, you say, in the days of activism in the 70s and 80s, the atmosphere of the Cold War and the nuclear standoff between the US and the Soviet Union, because of that era, you were fired by anti-communism. Not just because you had a negative view of the world, but you knew what communism did to people in countries it conquered. And rather loftily, you said, I wanted to help people in the third world, especially Southeast Asia, to build something better. I wanted to limit and possibly destroy communist influence in Australia. I must say, I think that's an incredibly noble cause. You said, I can't respect communism as an ideology. It was always inherently, of its essence, anti-democratic and anti-human. Not only that, the real existing communism of the Soviet Union, China and their dependencies in the 20th century systematically and intentionally slaughtered tens of millions of people. Terror, the jackboot forever stamping on the human face in Orwell's horrifying image, was as central to communism as it was to Nazism. During the Cold War, understanding communism was an abiding task for anyone involved in ideological politics, the labour movement, or geostrategic issues. How beautifully written, how well described the essential problem of communism and the threat it faced to the world. Greg, as some of the wonderful reviews of his book have already pointed out, makes reference to a conversation where Bob Carr is trying to get Tony Abbott and Greg to join the Labor Party on the basis that they're anti-communists. And he says to them, listen, if you're interested in fighting communism, there's no point in joining the Liberal Party. There aren't any communists in the Liberal Party. That hasn't always been the experience of people like Rod Kemp and I. But anyway, moving on. Greg talks passionately about the death of Kennedy and the effect that the death of Kennedy had on his life and his family and his thinking. He was killed on Greg's 7th birthday in 1963 when Greg was 7. Greg, I loved your reference to the nun who said to you, not that the president had been killed, but that the Catholic president had been killed. And I think to myself, when I listen to the ABC talk about climate change, it's dangerous climate change. It's not climate change, it's dangerous. And I thought, they've learnt something from the Catholics. It was a Catholic president. Greg talks about the danger that his family thought Whitlam posed to this country. He was too close to the communists. At 16, he says, what I did know was that there was too much influence in Labor, too much communist influence in Labor. Vietnam was also a reason for us, that is me, Dad and our close political friends, to be worried about a Whitlam government. By 1972, almost all Australian troops had been withdrawn from Vietnam, except for a small group of army trainers and a platoon to guard the Australian embassy in Saigon. It is a myth, and this is one of the things that John Roscoe refers to, that Whitlam, after he was elected, withdrew the bulk of Australian troops. He withdrew the small training team and the platoon guarding the embassy. Greg, of course, also exploded a number of other myths. I think later on, Greg, how many asylum seekers under the Pacific solution actually came to Australia? Not the 100% that Labor had said, but something closer to 40. Greg's also written about the scholarships offered by the Whitlam government and exposed myths about those who said they could only go to university because of scholarships offered by the Whitlam government. This is the type of truth-telling we've come to know from Greg Sheridan, and he's had an immense impact on the lives of so many Australians, and the use of Greg Sheridan's commentaries and works on a daily basis sustains a lot of us in the media from time to time who need to know what really happened in many of those days gone by. Greg talks also about the anti-Israel campaigns on campus, the hatred of Israel and Jewish students that he found, and how many Jewish students found this incredibly intimidating. On a lighter note, he talks about the architecture at Macquarie University. And Greg, if international affairs fails you ultimately, an architectural critic is a job awaiting you, because he beautifully describes the architecture at Macquarie University when he says this: "When you get to Macquarie Uni, your heart doesn't exactly sing with the lyric of the beauty of the place. The campus looked as though it was designed under the heading, 'Only concrete shall pass.' Squat, ugly concrete blobs arranged around the centrality of giant concrete car parks, the architecture gave full life to modern brutalism. That's no comment on the fine scholars who worked there, just the way the place looked, as I say, as a representative of the 1970s aesthetic." I think probably it was descriptive of the fine scholars that worked there, Greg, but you obviously couldn't say that. There's a couple of other things I loved about this book. Greg goes into detail explaining the three sections of the Communist Party that existed in Australia in the 70s and the groups we fought when we were on campus in the 70s. The pro-Soviet communists, the Maoists, who hated the pro-Soviet communists, the Trots that hated both of them. But in the next edition of Greg's book, he'll get on to talk about the Spartacists, who were the group that hated the other three. The Sparts at the AUS conference in 1978 had a very fine representative called Neil Florimel. Regrettably for Neil, he was the only Spartacist at that AUS conference. I don't know whether David Cragg is here tonight, but I wanted to thank David 37 years on behalf of all of us. Because if David Cragg hadn't seconded Neil Florimel's nomination for president of AUS, Neil wouldn't have been able to speak and regale us with why it was necessary to elect a Spartacist as president of the Australian Union of Students, a political ideology that regarded the Trots as softies. Greg goes through how he and Tony Abbott took over the Sydney Uni Liberal Club. They wanted a campaign, he told people. We didn't just want to run wine and cheese nights, which I think was a reflection on those that were running the club in those days. In conclusion, can I say, this is a deeply personal memoir. It's reflective, it's powerful, it's historical. Greg Sheridan, like many of us, is a product of the environment in which he grew up. And he's never changed. And thank goodness for that. And Australia is a richer place for having Greg Sheridan in this country, in writing for The Australian and other august journals over all those years. And Greg, we hope you sell many, many of these books to many Australians, and all power and strength to your arm. Congratulations.